Okay. So I always start off this quote imagery, with the great flood, the eye of God looking at you, and this idea, why are people so obsessed, with finding Atlantis? And again, as the YouTuber, what's her name? Lady of the Library. She has a PhD in ancient antiquities, and she explains the whole history of all the connections with Atlantis from Ignatius Donnelly to the Nazis, and there's this weird original sin that people just latch on to this, and how that was born from the occult, even some Gnosticism, as well as Catholicism and their ideas on Atlantis. And as a Catholic, I definitely believe Plato is most likely an outside source observing the tellings of Genesis by the Jews, the Sumerians, and the Phoenicians as well. So yeah, I just say you have to find the Garden of Eden if you're going to find Atlantis, because those two are definitely intertwined. And from since even Madame Blavatsky was kind of alluding to that. And again, I don't want to get into all the Nazi conspiracy ideas, because the Nazis, they want to take these legends and they want to plant the seed, the Garden of Eden, or the origins of all this in Germany, obviously because that was the political motive. But I don't think Blavatsky really believed that. I don't think when she was talking about the different races and all that, I think
Hmm.
she understood that there was definitely a connection with the Indus Valley, Samaria, and Egypt. But somehow some of her occult ideas got twisted up by later, occult people that were more white nationalists, and they wanted to place it back in Europe.
Okay.
So it has a connection with that sort of original idea of curiosity, desire for power, and controlling politics and civilization. But getting into the researchers, I really should give
I
homage
like
to,
how
of
you do
course,
this.
the African hypothesis. These are the guys that really promoted before I did. I'm the one on YouTube
Mhm.
really coming up with the claim that 100% Egypt is the Garden of Eden, and here's why. But I have to give credit. The reason why I say that is because of researchers like Ulf Richter of Schwabenheim, Germany, a researcher in ancient antiquities, and he contributed a lot to the website called Atlantopedia, which has great source on Atlantis and all the arguments and different things. I think they put Jimmy on the website as well. But Ulf Richter really was looking at the numbers, and he kind of figured out that, okay, there's something wrong with Plato's numbers. And
Mhm.
Plato isn't necessarily wrong. It's just over the times, the units of measurements and how we measure things got changed. And he's saying that, well, if you take into the Egyptian count of measurement, now it starts to make sense on the shape of the canals, on the size of Atlantis, the plane, and every other detail. It's like, oh, well, now it starts to make sense. Now it fits more logical and more rational, not something the size of London. Okay. So then when we go even further back to 1930s, or in the 50s, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
Egyptologist J. Gwynne Griffiths. This is a book you should read, definitely.
Okay.
And I think Dr. David Miano, as well as Lady of the Library, the YouTuber, she
Mhm.
cited him. And he's really the first to kind of piece the connection with Atlantis and Egypt and Persia. And he definitely gives homage. And he died, yeah, I think in the 90s, I believe it was. Um, so he was definitely the first to really, I think, push this. And I guess I should give credit to Blavatsky and all of them. They all understood that it had something to do with Mesopotamia and Egypt and Indus Valley.
Okay.
And then I give credit to Hideki Anno. He's the first guy, anime or movie director that got me interested in Atlantis when I was like back in the 90s when I first saw the anime Nadia Secrets of Blue Water. I was like so fascinated with this. I'm like, oh, it seems rational. Like I didn't really know much about Atlantis at all, but
Mhm.
he also did his research, a lot of research, I think, in order to make his Nadia. But guess what? He's inspired by Zachary Sitchins and Eric Von Daniken, 100%. This maybe James Cameron a little bit too, but probably a little less so. But definitely Hideki Anno. You can see it everywhere in his shows. But he's definitely putting with the story of Nadia. He's definitely putting it back in Africa, which is
Mhm.
interesting because the anime Nadia is what inspired Disney's Atlantis. And a lot of YouTubers who study movies, they would say, yeah, like nostalgia critic Doug Walker, he would say, yeah, it's pretty clear that Disney was ripping off Hideki Anno, and Hideki Anno didn't get any credit from Disney.
Mhm.
So that's pretty interesting that his obscure anime inspired Disney's Atlantis, but Disney's Atlantis wanted to fit to more Native American style, like that, because that's what Ignatius Donnelly was promoting.
Mhm.
Ignatius Donnelly was starting to think that Atlantis was like North and South America,
Okay.
basically the Americas, and that they came over to America, they established, and maybe they were in an island in the literal Atlantic, but he knew there was some connection with Egypt. Of course, Ignatius Donnelly wanted to sell books, and he got popularized the whole idea, but he wasn't digging too deep like me and Jake Glenn Griffiths and Ulf Richter. But
Okay.
yeah, definitely Hideki Anno, on the other hand, he wanted to keep it back in Africa, which I think makes sense. As well as Jimmy from Corsetti. He's the one that really popularized the idea of putting it back in Africa. Now, he didn't come up with the Rickhat structure as a hypothesis. It was another group, I think from Spain, maybe. I forgot the researcher's name, but he's the one that started. But then it was Jimmy that really popularized and exploded the idea, and the video went viral because people appeal to pareidolia. They just see something that looks circular, oh my gosh, and they take it very literal. And that's how it got popular, I think.
Hmm.
But Jimmy is right to look back to Africa. He's really the first big YouTuber to say, well, maybe it's not in the literal Atlantic as um, Randall Carlson kind of wants to appeal to the Azores, or as some others want to appeal to Bimini Road, and they just keep pushing it farther back. But that's when you look deeper, you find out that's not the original Atlantic.
Mm.
And of course, I'm not sure why there's a space there, but I have a master's in landscape architecture, so and anthropology. So I would promote that I am the first YouTuber to truly come with the claim that 100%, like, yes, based off these researchers, we have to look back to Egypt.
Right,
But
right.
again, we need to give credit to this book right here, Atlantis and Egypt. So I highly encourage people to check out this book. What's interesting is Griffiths didn't want to specifically say that Egypt was Atlantis, but he's basically saying that. But he's like, well, at the same time, there's some Persian elements I'm seeing. So he's getting a little confused. So he's saying
Mm.
it's a partial historical pastiche,
Hmm.
mythological pastiche. It's historical, but also mythological. And that's how the Greeks were telling stories and political allegory. They're connecting a lot of different things. They just didn't write history in the way we write history nowadays.
Hmm.
So he's the first to really connect that.
Okay.
And then, of course, Ulf Richter gets into the numbers, and he figured out that there's definitely a mistranslation when it comes to the cubit and the meh measurements, word for meh measurement in Egyptian. So he figured out what's the approximate size of Atlantis.
All right.
And then, of course, George Sarantitis, he's also figured out that there's also other clues that point back to the Mediterranean as the origins for Atlantis. And he noticed that the idea of Pillars of Hercules has association with specific places in Greece, not way out in Gibraltar. And he kind of explains how that got shifted over time. So these guys, they were on the main website, Atlantopedia, as well as their own websites that they establish in books. So again, kind of going back to
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT.
So I need to ask the question, people don't know this. And this is where Jimmy just didn't quite look up deeply enough on this. Did the Mediterranean Sea, it was known as the Middle Sea, but was it also referred to as the Atlantic Sea in ancient times? And according to ChatGPT, which gets the knowledge from the internet basically, and it said yes to the ancient Greeks, but only around the time of Solon. In Plato's time,
Hmm.
that's when they were starting to discover the other regions, but it wasn't really the Greeks that discovered that. It
Hmm.
was the Phoenicians
All right.
before the Greeks. But I don't think even Plato was referring to the Straits of Gibraltar, because people like Solon and even Homer, they all associate to their worldview with these specific island regions. So yeah, ChatGPT is explaining that yes, it was called the Atlantic Sea because there's no distinction. Once the Phoenicians found the Atlantic Ocean, they still called it the Atlantic Sea. They just shifted the name now in that location.
All right.
But that's where, until the Romans came along, the Romans really emphasized that this is now the new Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, and that's where we're we're not looking far back enough in time. And we keep saying, "Oh, Plato said past the Pillars of Hercules." Well, you know, during the Romans that made sense, but during the Greek periods, no, it's in their worldview, not way out near the western part of the Mediterranean,
Okay.
and that's where Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, um, Robert Sepper, the white nationalist guy, and others just get it wrong. Okay, you gotta put things in the perspective of this poet, Stesichorus. He's the one that kind of popularized in his writings the idea of the Atlantic Sea, but it wasn't just called Atlantic Sea; it was also called the Middle Sea. I mean, there's
Yeah.
multiple people called it different things, but it was definitely associated to the Mediterranean. So then I said, Was Plato's Atlantis inspired by travels in Egypt? And basically, ChatGPT said it is worth noting that Plato was, acquainted with the Egyptian civilization through other sources and may have drawn upon certain elements of Egyptian mythology or history when constructing his narrative for Atlantis. So yes, Plato was inspired by Egypt. So, but this is definitely the person, it's the Stickers Greek poet in 600 BC. Around 600 BC, they really didn't know about the Atlantic Ocean, what we call it today. They didn't know about that because they call the Atlantic Ocean, or specifically sea, as the Mediterranean in their perspective. And even possibly even Plato's perspective. So, because Plato's telling the account of Solon, but at Plato's time, they were starting to discover the Atlantic Ocean, not the Greeks, but the Phoenicians, and they were hearing rumors about it. Right. That's why in this map, in Homer's map, they've just put a general, simple idea that there's a giant ocean around the whole land of Earth, basically, and there's a main continent. But again, this is not really a map that Homer made. This is cartographers trying to figure out using Homer's words to make up a map. So this is not an ancient map. This is just 18th century people, cartographers trying to figure out, okay, what is Homer saying? So then they start applying other words. So these may not be like where actually Libya is, because during time of Homer, Libya was normally associated to this region where it was more green and there's more vegetation there. It was more suitable to establish colonies over there, not in Libya as much. But then there were small pockets, but then over time, it kind of is a broad term to say the whole area. I mean, it just depends on the person at the time. There was no consensus on the names of some of these locations. But basically, you should actually look at this map like sideways, and then you go across this ocean, across the Atlantic Sea, and that's the other side. And referring to the islands, Plato references that you have to cross these other islands, and then past those islands is like a gateway to the bigger sea. So when Plato says, you cross these other islands and then there's a gateway, and that is the Atlantic Sea. And I have to also give credit to Muhammad Ibrahim. I don't know if you know him. Have you heard of him?
I've heard the name does sound familiar, and the face does. Yeah. I don't know if this is your picture or not, and I've seen it from something that you had or not, but
this is Muhammad Ibrahim. He lives in Egypt, and I think he's a tour guide as well, and he knows Egyptian, and he's always believed that it's Atlantis was always referring to Egypt. Yeah, Third Eye would know him. And he's always emphasized that Atlantis is just Egypt. I don't know why people think it's in the Little Atlantic, but I'm not sure if Muhammad Ibrahim was aware that the Greeks actually believed the Mediterranean Sea was called the Atlantic Sea. He might have been aware of that, but he hasn't mentioned that in some of his videos. So it'd be interesting to ask him that. But he's the first Egyptian to really popularize the idea that yes, Egypt is really Atlantis. And he explains why. He's saying, look at the architecture. You see any pyramids in Europe? No. You see any pyramids in South America? Not true pyramids. They're pyramids, but they're built upon, like a Russian doll. They're built upon each other, and they're not a true pyramid. There's a difference. They're step pyramids, and they're brick, and they're not megalithic. I agree with him on that. And he also mentions there's two priests. We know there's Solstice of Sias, but there's also Senephis, or I'm not sure how you say his name pronunciation, but there's a second priest that Solon had supposedly visited in Egypt. There are two of them, not just Solstice of Sias, and there's more than two, to be honest. There's two names that we definitely know, and these guys were telling of a story that's like Atlantis. Now the question is there some mistranslation in the sense that maybe there's some mistranslation that the priests were talking in a way that implying that Egypt is Atlantis. We're talking about ourselves here. They weren't talking about something way out in the literal Atlantic. The Egyptians didn't really know about that. I don't think they knew about the area. Maybe some rumors and stuff, but they didn't explore that far. They stayed in the Eastern Mediterranean region, where the geopolitical space was. So it's more than likely these two priests, as they're talking with Solon, they were saying they're describing their land. Okay, but somehow it got mistranslated. We don't have the exact quotes necessarily from these two priests, and there could be some mistranslations there. And I think that's where we have to appeal to basic logic and study the architecture and say, okay, well, which civilization looks most Atlantean? It's the Egyptians. So, for example,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And because even the one clue would be the Pillars of Hercules. Okay, so the obelisk were originally referred to as like needles to the Greeks. They were like a pointing a needle pointing up to heaven, as above, so below. There's a connection between heaven and earth, and the idea of the resurrection of the soul, the body into eternal life, and the resurrection of a civilization. And that's why the Freemasons put an obelisk in Washington, D.C., because it's showing the resurrection of like a new Atlantis. That's why there's an obelisk in Washington, D.C. It's not just a monument to George Washington. It's a little bit more inspirational than that. That's why the Masons give so much honor in the architecture of Egypt, because Egypt was the first civilization to truly have advanced architecture. Okay, so the original pillars of Hercules, I believe, are most likely the obelisks of Egypt. And then when the Greeks, encountered this at, let's say, 800 BC, the time of Homer, this is the first time the Greeks, at 800 BC, this temple right here did not exist. So they were exploring, and when they got boats and they were able to travel and trade, and they found out about the Egyptians, they were probably shocked. They're like, "Holy crap!" Because some of these temples, is maybe the first iterations, these may have been recycled, existed, and especially in Heliopolis. So when they encountered these, they were like totally inspired. So they got all their mathematical knowledge, architectural knowledge, astronomy, even their mythologies are inspired from Egypt. A lot of historians would accept that the Greeks definitely were inspired by Egypt. And possibly even the Egyptians may have settled, or people from Egypt settled in the Greek world, and specifically the Minoans.
Right.
So going back at least to 800 BC. So Plato is trying to describe a civilization, really far back in time, not necessarily to a younger Dryas, as I explained in my first video on the Garden of Eden, but definitely a long time in the ancient world's perspective. So there's two types of pillars now. Over time, it transitioned from obelisks and to Greek temples on top of islands, between islands. So that's a threshold space, and that's where George Sarantites explains that the Pillars of Hercules was always mainly associated to the Greek island, the archipelago of Greece. And then from there, they would put these temples with literal columns dedicated to either Hercules. But again, the concept of these demigods and Hercules, those ideas probably were inspired by Egyptian gods. And then the Greeks reinterpreted to fit to their language.
Right.
And then now they're adopting the Pillars of Hercules from Egypt and putting it onto the islands to represent the political space that they ruled and they were trying to establish. But Egypt, the Greeks didn't really explode until after the Egyptians. So once they started, all these Greek philosophers went to Egypt and they got all this knowledge, architects, politicians, if you want to call them politicians, they brought all that back to Greece, and then they were able to build these temples on top of these islands as an honor. And they realized, so Plato was telling of the discovery of this Atlantean civilization, and that was Egypt. He was telling that to his people and trying to explain, as an allegory as well, and using that story for other political narratives. So yeah, it's referring to like pillars of the Titans, the demigods, the pharaohs, a stela, megalithic tablets, or markers of rulership. For example, there's a city in Egypt called Herculaneum that the Greeks named. And there's, it's always associated, Pillars of Hercules has always been associated with temples originally. So that's why I think there's a connection with Egypt there. And then the Greeks adopted that with their own temples. And I don't know if you have any questions there, but
Oh no, I'm following you so far. I'm rolling with you.
Okay, so coming back to like Hidekiano, and this is where Hidekiano started connect the name Tartessos with Egypt as well in his anime Nadia. And I asked the question, why was he doing that? Well, that's because I found out the Greeks, Herodotus and others, they started naming Tartessos as a reference to watery land. Okay. So what's the river that the Greeks encountered that really inspired them? Well, it's definitely the Nile. There's no rivers in Spain that were as big as Egypt's. No rivers until you get up to Northern Europe, but they didn't really explore that. Okay. It was too cold. Not enough mountains were in the way, and the Celtics were all kind of separated. The Vikings, Celtics were all kind of scattered until they started consolidating their power as their population grew. But it's definitely seems clear that Phoenician architecture and styles were definitely inspired by Egypt. And we know there's a direct linguistic connection, according to a lot of linguistic anthropologists. The YouTuber Masaman, he explains this pretty clearly that there is definitely a linguistic connection. So Hideki Anno saw that. He's like, okay, well, there might be, okay, if Tartessos is really a reference to the Nile, and Tartessos has legends about giants as well. And that's where the connection with the biblical connection is with the Og and the Sumerian gods that reference to giants come in, and Hideki was trying to connect that, and he knew there's some connection with the Bible and with Atlantis, and Plato is simply an external source of an older story.
Mm-hmm.
So then he connected that. He put the image, this actual painting behind this Egyptian looking pharaoh guy is an actual painting that was in the 17th century depicting the sort of like the Nephilim, or like it's really more, it became more political, symbolizing like the government is eating you up and consuming you, but it was more like this, well, I forgot what it's called, this father eating his own children idea, and it goes back to the whole Nephilim as cannibals and all that. It gets kind of deep there, but so this is kind of where I wanted to show Third Eye, at the same time, Plato's Atlantis is definitely inspired by Persia, and that's according to J. Gwynne Griffiths in his book Atlantis and Egypt. And he said that Herodotus is talking about these round city states. Well, Plato was reading Herodotus's work because Herodotus explored Persia,
right?
And he visited some of these round cities. They're not sure if he visited Gur or the round city was actually. I'm sorry, this is around 180 AD, but this tradition lasted that long, all the way up to the round city of Baghdad as well. So it's a possibility that Egypt might have had a round city, but Egypt mostly built squared rectangular city states. And the Persians resorted to circular, because Persians want to really connect the idea that they are the heavenly realm sort of idea. But the Egyptians want to use the square as a symbol of the earthly plane, and circle is the symbol of the heavenly plane.
So when they built in the circle way, they was representing the heavenly plane.
Yeah, Darius the First was getting a little cocky, I think, and he was basically saying, "I am, the heavenly demigod, and I am bringing the whole world as the center, and Darabagerd is the center, Ekbatana and Susa, all these city states that were round. They built three of them apparently. So there's Susa, there's Darabagerd, and Ekbatana. I'm not sure if Susa was round; it might have been more ovalish shape, but it's definitely associated with the Persians. They're the first to truly make a perfectly round city state with a palace in the center. So this is what the erosion looks like after. In the middle. Yeah, this is what it looks like after 500, BC of erosion. That time over, 2,500 years ago. So if that's what 2,500 years of erosion looks like. Now place that on a river. So yeah, it could be wiped out in Egypt. If Egypt truly had a circle city state, it would probably be at Cairo. And
why Cairo?
Cairo, I would say Cairo because it's facing Giza. And it's at the head of what, as I mentioned in my first presentation, the Garden of Eden. The entrance into the main part of the Garden of Eden was the Delta. And that was the geopolitical choke point. So that would have been where the capital of Atlantis was. But Plato alludes to that there was not just, there were at least 10 kingdoms. Well, where is he getting that from? Well, according to J. Gwynne Griffiths, he's saying, well, actually, Egypt had 12, with one main capital being at Memphis or Heliopolis. And the rest of the 12, the rest of them were separated kingdoms, but they all gave homage and tribute to the main capital, where the pharaoh resided near the three main pyramids, and the Sphinx looking at the capital. And there might have been another Sphinx on the other side, possibly. There are rumors about that, but that might have got completely eroded. But I would say, yeah, if Egypt did build a round city, it's possible because their hieroglyph for city is a circle. Now, is that because they were observing circular city states like the city of Mari in Syria, or Baghdad, or Babylon, what they call it now? Now they say Babylon might have been rectangular, so it's still kind of a debate whether originally it was a circular, then it went back to rectangular, then it went back to circle. But yeah, it's very clear that Plato is definitely getting inspiration from Herodotus' tellings of these round city states, but he's exaggerating it probably a little bit, or the numbers are definitely mistranslated. This was about 1.5 miles or 1.3 miles in diameter. So we're not talking about something so massive. We're talking about something pretty confined, and To a lot of new agers, that's disappointing. They're like, oh, I want Atlantis to be some mega city like London. But, Ulf Richter would say that makes no
Well,
sense.
they also wanted to have very advanced technology. When I say advanced technology, I'm talking about what we have, what we
Yeah.
have. They want to have more of it. So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
just it's that desire to eat from the forbidden fruit, thinking that technology is going to save us. But I think ironically, it's going to be our detriment because if you believe in climate change or environmental things, I don't think all this stuff is sustainable for the next 1,000 years. I really
Nah.
don't think so. I think we're gonna start going downhill. We're gonna end up being Atlantis in some sense. At least America sort of sees itself as Atlantis because in the concept idea of it that there are two oceans on either side of
Yeah.
America and America's spreading its power all over the world and it's reaching its limits. So these are the other clues. Now you've heard about the debate, of course, the Little Mermaid and all that. It starts
Mhm.
when you look deeply into the origins of mermaids. They're not sexy, cute women.
I
I mean,
actually looked it up a while ago. What the origins of the
yeah, it has a
this?
Mesopotamian connection.
Yep,
And it has
sure does.
possibly an Egyptian connection too, but I think the motifs have changed. And the idea of the mermaid design is definitely a little bit more. I think the Minoans had some depictions of that actually. The Minoans, I know,
There's
especially the
depictions
Mesopotamians.
all around the world with something like this.
Yeah, it's
With
that
the, I mean,
motif.
we're just using our modern concept and ideas of what a mermaid is because of what we, the different ideas that we had back then. I mean, there was only so many people who could draw or do some type of art like that, so they left only
Yeah.
there's only a little bit of clues of it. But now, especially with the AI, image creator, you come up with so many different ideas.
Yeah. So I guess I'm not too concerned. Like, yeah, people are angry because, she's black, but in some sense, it might make sense if the origins of mermaids actually comes from Egypt and Mesopotamia. They would have been darker skinned. So,
Hey,
but actually, ancient times they would have been men. They were very masculine. They had beards and they had a fish body. It was a symbol that the king
yeah.
conquered the seas. He gathered the fish for his people and
Mm-hmm.
he could distribute that food for everybody. It showed a representation of that he can, organize fishing labor and
Yeah,
all that and
basically a fisherman.
disperse it. Yeah, fisher of men. That's the
Mm-hmm.
phrase that Jesus kind of says. You're going to be a fisher of men. The king is always seen like that, sort of. He's a fisher of men. At the same time, he's a shepherd. That's why the Pharaoh, his staff, is normally a cane or a
Mm-hmm.
snake head on the cane.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the original trident.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the Greeks that came up with the concept of the trident, the actual
Yeah.
pitchfork. That's an Egyptian Greek original design,
Mm-hmm.
but they got that inspiration more than likely from Egypt because the trident, when you find out what that word really means, refers to the land of Tritonus.
Mm-hmm.
And if you study the origins of the Amazons and the stories about that, you start to see there's a connection again. They mentioned Atlantis with the Amazons fighting Atlantis. But again, it's more of a political pun or allegory message to saying, "Oh, look, we beat the evil Persians." And there's a propaganda in Plato's Atlantis, and it's that propaganda is supposed to be pushed onto its people against the Persians. But
Mm-hmm.
if you peel back that propaganda and you find the original inspirations, you get all these other clues. For
Yeah.
example, elephants. Egypt had elephants. Okay, the pharaohs gathered some elephants from southern regions of Egypt as trophies. Not many, but there's evidence that they tried to do that, and eventually that passed up to the Romans. Definitely horses. Okay, horses came into Egypt right around probably 4,000 BC, maybe even older, possibly from the Yamnaya cultures of Ukraine down into Anatolia, and eventually those horses diversified and became more robust. And there's a second wave of horse migration that is right around 3,000 or 4,000 BC, I think. It's not the horses of like Siberia. Those aren't the ones that came to the Middle East. Those
Mm-hmm.
stayed up in Mongolia and those were smaller horses. No, the pharaohs want the best horses. So
Yeah, the
they
best.
ordered the trading of horses from probably Anatolia is where they got most of those. And that was probably around 3,000, 4,000 BC. And possibly again, Plato might be right about the round city states inspired by Persia, but also possibly Egypt may have had a round city state. And that would probably be at Cairo at the head of Giza, the head of the snake. Or it could have been square. Does it have to be round? I mean, technically, it makes theological sense that the pharaohs would associate the square because the square symbolized the earthly plane, the circle symbolized the heavenly plane, and you shouldn't be making your cities too circular because, first of all, it's not efficient. Because the Egyptians were the first to truly make a modern grid layout city state.
Mm-hmm.
They were the first to truly do that, and Jefferson, of course, adopted that when starting building the cities of in Virginia. They wanted to build a simple grid system that was modeled off of the French and the English, who got inspiration from the Greeks. The Greeks started building grid systems of city design, and that came from Egypt. But the Persians wanted to build round cities, but the Persian cities weren't meant to be very big. They were more palace city states for the king and the people that worked around him. But they weren't necessarily for the peasants. Whereas in Egypt, they did have squared temple complexes, and then outside that, there was an area for the peasants, and then another wall outside that, possibly. Another clue Plato tells us is the idea of an island. Technically, Egypt is an island. It's an island oasis, okay, surrounded by a sea of sand and water, the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the sands of the Sahara. So it's possible there's some mistranslation there, that Plato is trying to describe that this land is like an island, but maybe they didn't quite have the proper word for oasis. There could be some mistranslations there, that maybe he was referring to it was an oasis, but he gives us other clues. He's saying it was well watered. He said that the rain never falls on this land. It comes from the ground. That's referring to the Nile and the canals and the springs and the wells that they had there. So I think it's pretty clear he's getting inspiration from that. He also gives us another clue: black, red, and white stones. Well, what's that referring to? Architecturally, I'm looking down, that's pretty obvious. Black diorite, red granite, and white limestone.
Yep.
I think that was pretty obvious to the Greeks when they saw those pyramids. Another clue Plato gives us is the metals. Okay, Egypt, where did the Greeks get most of their gold? It wasn't from Greece. Okay, gold they tend to get it from rivers and the cliffs of the Nile Valley, as well as the land of Punt in Ethiopia regions of the highlands. So yeah, it's pretty clear that most of the gold that came to Greece came out of Egypt. And then they melt it back down and they use it for currency or whatever. So I think it's very clear that when he mentions orichalcum, it's a reference to alloyed of bronze, which the Egyptians had, or simply copper. And copper was very valuable. It was the most valuable metal, second to gold, as Plato alludes to, because copper was used in warfare. Okay, it was used to make bronze. Gold was not used for swords. Okay, they were ornamentation, just due to the type of malleability of the metal. But Plato also alludes to, again, this idea of an island, oasis, but also a plain, a flat, level plain with mountains on either side, but not very high, he says. That probably is referring to plateaus. Egypt had plateau-like mountains in the southern kind of regions of Egypt. So, and he, of course, he mentions the clue about canals, which Egypt had. He mentions that there's this mountain temple to Poseidon, and that's probably the pyramids. But he's poetically kind of rephrasing it to fit to his cultural identity. But the idea of Poseidon and the Trident, I definitely think that's coming from the inspiration of Egypt. As well as, let's see. So he also mentions the idea of the most ferocious animal. Okay, well, what would that be in that world at the time? Well, I think that's the lion, because of the Sphinx. The lion is associated to the ferociousness, virility of the pharaoh, or the queen, possibly. So I think because they use sphinxes a lot and they put heads on the sphinxes, it symbolizes the power of the pharaohs and the queens of Egypt. Okay, and that was the ferocious animal. It was the idea of Disney's Lion King. The literal Lion King is inspired by Egyptian motifs of lions with a human head on top, symbolizing the power of the pharaoh. Okay, so even Tolkien, I think, brings us not Tolkien, the story of Narnia, who I forgot the author's name who brought that story. But the lion is always a depiction sort of Jesus as well. It's symbolizing the power of a god. But yes, the lion was considered the most ferocious animal to the Greeks. and eventually they were brought up to the Romans and they were put into gladiator fights because it was fun to watch get people get mauled by lions apparently. So, and you see this idea of the lion motif continue into Europe. Okay, every king, a lot of them either chose a dragon or a lion. And the dragon, again, go back far enough in the origins of what inspired the dragon, it's snakes. And guess what Egypt is shaped like? It's shaped like a snake. In the Bible, they reference the idea of the snake, Lucifer as a snake, an angel of light, and its depiction of the gods. Again, it's symbolic motif because animals have a certain look to them. Like, sometimes when you like watch these animal videos on Facebook, whatever, you see that a cat has, this cuteness and fluffiness, and people associate cats to women and men as dogs. Okay. And that's the same kind of symbolic depiction the Egyptians are adopting, but with many animals. But mainly the lion is definitely considered the most ferocious. And that's what Plato was alluding to. Again, the Persians adopted this. Of course, Plato alludes to that there were demigods that ruled over Atlantis, and I think that was a connection with, again, the Nephilim and the giants, these unusual humans, and there could be a connection with something supernatural, and that might be for a later talk. Again, 10 kingdoms, but Plato says 10, but Egypt actually had 12, so maybe the number got off a little bit, but he's definitely inspired by the idea that Egypt was divided by these different kingdoms. Each kingdom had this palace city state in a square of maybe 10 to 20,000 people in each living in each one, and then they controlled a certain region of Egypt. But there was one head of the lion, and that was up at Giza in Memphis and Heliopolis. But there might have been a lost city state that was before Heliopolis, and I would bet there is, and I bet it's buried underneath Cairo or it's been taken apart for the building of Memphis, Heliopolis, and everything else around Egypt. Okay. So it could be lost, but I think more archaeological evidence has to be dug up for that to really come with that conclusion. But you might not need to have a round city state. It's just simply Plato chose the circular city states because of the Persians mainly, and they're trying to make a political allegory. But he's inspired by two locations. Again, there's no rain, as well as the Plato mentions the idea there was Atlantis sunk, and literally we're looking at this. Okay, there are literal cities in Egypt that are sunken. There's Heliopolis. Heliopolis was under mud mostly. There was Herculaneum underwater, Alexandria as well. And so these city-states that they saw were inspired. And even Sais is completely covered up and eroded away. It's almost gone. It was a palace, small city-state with, maybe 10,000 people around it living there. So Egypt had multiple little city-states scattered around with a central temple complex. But there are literally ruins off the coast of the Nile Delta fan. And I wish I would tell, James Cameron kind of wasted his time, I think, looking for Atlantis near Sicily. Okay. He should have spent that money, get a submarine, get a LiDAR, some detection thing, and scan the floor of the Nile Delta fan about 3 miles out or even just 1 mile out. They would have found something on the east side of the Delta. And they've already found stuff on the west side, and they're digging that up, and they found this depiction of Osiris right here, just a stone monument. They found megaliths under, 30 feet, 40 feet of water. So this is the closest thing you're going to get to an Atlantis. You don't get this in Dwarka. Oh, there's ruins in Dwarka. There's nothing in Dwarka, okay? It was a little canal. They had some anchors, some brick walls. Okay, sure. But there's no megaliths. There's no granite. There's no statues, nothing, okay? But Egypt has that. No other civilization has ruins the size that Egypt has under 30 feet of water. Okay, so Plato must have known that Egypt had ruins underwater. Somehow, and that's why he said it sunk. And he does mention Egypt.
Right.
But
there's a lot of it. There's still a lot of it still uncovered on the water right now. Like, was it the Aswan Dam was covered up?
Yeah. Well, that's a recent flooding. Yeah, there's stuff that's covered up. They did document all that, so they do have records of what they covered up because they need a dam in order to build electricity in that region. But yeah, that's all underwater now. That's a modern version of the sinking of Atlantis. Right. Again, Atlantis got sunk again by modern civilization, and it got sunk by Cairo.
Right.
And Cairo was built on top of everything, and everything just got buried deeper and deeper and deeper. So there could be many more megaliths under the city of Cairo. But most likely the Persians took a lot of it, broke it down, building their cities. because the Persians did conquer Egypt, and they were inspired by Egypt. Of course, the Persians want to be like the Neo-Atlanteans, as J. Gwen Griffiths kind of depicts Persia as like the Neo-Atlant. They are
Mm,
trying to become like Egypt, sort of.
mm,
But there's other clues. There's again the idea of the continent. So again, Plato is alluding to Africa. He's saying there's a continent and there's an island within that continent, and that island is that oasis. And from there, it stretches from Libya, the Moroccan region of Libya, not modern day Libya, to Egypt. He actually mentions this, Egypt. And but when he says Egypt, Egypt wasn't necessarily referring to the Nile Valley at the time and how the
mm,
Greeks interpreted the phrase Egypt. Egypt was referring to the desert regions outside. So the Eden, the Egypt. So he's saying from the west to the east, all of that is sort of like Atlantis. But he said there's a Pacific island of Atlantis, and that's the oasis. And I think that's very clear when you read the book Atlantis and Egypt. I think he's piecing together the pieces there. And he's saying, okay, but he wasn't willing to go right away and say 100% yes, it's Egypt. But I'm willing to bet that the whole time Plato definitely was associating with Egypt, but he was using he already knew that Egypt was like a lost civilization. But
mm.
by that time, many Greeks had already visited Egypt.
Yeah.
But 800 BC, that's the time the Greeks first discovered Egypt, and they were probably pretty shocked to find this civilization. And that's how the birth of the legend came about. And Plato made up a name basically. Well, actually, the word Atlantis and Atlas that was before Plato, but he's referring to a land. When he says Tis, I think Tis is kind of referring to some conjugation to association with land, just like Memphis, Atlantis. There's some conjugation there. But yeah,
Uh,
that's my last slide. But I would definitely say there's plenty
okay.
of clues to point that Egypt was even a naval power. Okay, it conquered the Eastern Mediterranean region all
Hmm.
the way up to Syria and back down. And but at the same time, Plato said that Atlantis wasn't really an empire. At first, they were not very good at war. He was might be alluding specifically to the Persians because he's trying to say, oh, look, the Persians, they're like women, they suck at war. I don't know. Like he could be having some propaganda there, but if you peel that propaganda back and look to these other characteristics, I think it's very clear that the inspiration for Atlantis is Egypt. Now the question is, did Plato literally believe Atlantis was a lost civilization? And to the Greeks, I bet they thought that at 800 BC when they first discovered Egypt, they're like, okay, this is a crazy civilization, and it sparked their civilization. The Greeks would not have come about if they did not discover the mathematics, the architecture, the mythologies, and all that.
Right on,
But
right
does
on.
that convince you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,